Is your conscience the voice of God? Oh my gosh, this is a fantastic question. So, is your conscience the voice of God? This has been the question, one of the questions for me in regards to Christianity and even spirituality. Hearing God. Now, there's a lot of different ways that people are like, "Oh, I hear God in this." All right, I don't hear God, as my conscience. I hear it, in like numerology, or some of my friends are like, "I don't hear God in my thoughts. I have visions," and I'm like, "Okay." So this is the question though, because a lot of Christians, a lot of people, I should just, generalize it more. I say Christians because that's how I grew up, but generalizing it more with people who believe in God, saying that they hear the voice of God, it has always been my question. I'm like, but was that your conscience speaking? Was that you just coming to the realization that you needed to do this differently, or that this was actually the answer? Because I think if God does exist, I don't think he would talk in that way. I could be completely wrong. I could be totally wrong. But here's why I say that. Is because I feel like the people who label God basically as their conscience, they become God, and they can misinterpret everything and anything that they think about. And I've witnessed that. I've become victim to that, where before, years ago, I was like, well, this is what God told me. And it's like years later, I'm like, oh no, that was 100% totally me. But here's the thing. I think if God exists, I think calling your conscience, like you hear the voice of God through your conscience, I think that is downgrading God. I think that's downgrading the voice of God. I think that is, that's not giving God the credit he deserves. And so, calling your conscience God, I think a lot of Christians say, "Oh, I hear the voice of God very well," but they hear their conscience very well. And here's the thing: I don't think I don't think we're giving ourselves enough credit, because I think that, if God created us, I think that he would be smart enough, hopefully, to set up a system in us to where we can learn lessons on our own. Like, we're smart enough to figure that out. But there's a lot of Christians who they hear their conscience speaking, and they're like, God told me this. And I'm like, I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit, because you're smart enough to figure these things out. You're smart enough to work that out in your brain. Why do you have to say it's God? Like, it was you. Yeah, I know that's not a bad thing. Give yourself credit in this. Like, that's a good thing. So, anyway, those are just some of my issues with it. But I do think it is a huge thing that needs to be addressed. Like, is the voice of God your conscience? I don't think it is. Now, some people would argue, well, I'm saved, I've been born again, my spirit is made alive, and so therefore my spirit has taken over my body, and I hear through my conscience now. It's like, okay, so are you perfect? Are you without fault? Do you always hear the voice of God? If the voice, because God doesn't speak in English, Spanish, Chinese, Asian, he doesn't speak in any language. If he would speak in something, I would assume it would be by, like, Robert Monroe, what he says in his books, where it's like people in the astral world or outer dimensions speak in NVC, nonverbal communication. So I would think that you would be able to hear God, not in your conscience, but through your feelings and your gut feeling. But that's a problem as well, because our feelings don't always tell the truth. Our feelings can lie to us easily, no problem. And so it's like, what is the voice? What is the voice of God? How do we hear that? Um, Now, my theory in this is, since God would maybe, possibly, if he's real, be outside of time. And so I think that when I hear something, or when I hear something, when I thought or think maybe this could be God, I wait like a week. And I'm feeling, hearing, sensing the same thing, then I'm like, maybe, possibly, that could be God. I don't know. But then again, maybe that's just me being smart enough to figure it out over time. So I think it's a huge dilemma that does need to be addressed, especially in Christianity and the church, because I know a lot of people who are like, oh man, I'm so good at hearing the voice of God. And it's like, dude, that's totally your conscience. And you're totally just You're basically your own God, but you're using the philosophy of the Bible, which is religion, to interpret what you hear in your conscience. So, and this, all this goes back to it's in another video that I made that I said on live. It goes back to the weight of belief and the weight of the voice. Like, claiming that you believe in God is already like, there's a huge responsibility attached to that. But claiming that you're hearing the voice of God, that doesn't just affect you, but the people who claim to hear the voice of God, that affects other people as well. Where you say, "Oh, God told me this about you," or "The God told me this about you and your situation." It's like, "Yeah, wait, hold on. When it's no longer about you, there's no room for error." Like, you got to have that figured out, because if you're telling somebody else that God told you that, you better have it right, because there's no room for error in that, when somebody else's feelings and life possibly could depend on that. And a lot of people do, when it's like, "Oh, God said this." People will change their entire life because of that right there. "Well, my friend told me that God said this, and I trust my friend." And I'm like, so, but could that have just been, your friend's conscience and his thoughts about it, but he interpreted it as God, or he didn't want to admit that it was himself, so he said, "Well, this must be God." There's a host of issues with that. So that's why I love that question, because it's a great question, and it's something that very much needs to be addressed. Yeah, like to know your thoughts on that, because I don't have the answer.